The Oral History Criminology Project, in conjunction with the American Society of Criminology, is pleased to present a conversation today, October 14th, 2016, with Adrian Raine. He's been kind enough to grant us space here at the Jerry Lee Center for Criminology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he currently serves as university professor. Before we get into sort of the nuts and bolts of the nitty-gritty of his life and his career, just for the record, a brief introduction to those who have not had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Raine. In 1977, Adrian graduated with a BA in honors BA in experimental psychology from Jesus College, Oxford University. In 1982, he earned his MA in experimental psychology from the same institution, and as well as the DPhil in psychology from the University of York, where he authored a dissertation entitled Socialization, Psychometrics, and Psychophysiology. In terms of his professional posts over the course of the years, his current position is at the university professor and the Richard Perry Professor of Criminology, Psychiatry, and Psychology here at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. In 1987, he assumed his first academic post as an assistant professor, working his way to full professor through the ranks at the University of Southern California Department of Psychology. From 1999 to 2007, he assumed the Robert Granford Wright Professor in Psychology and Neuroscience programs at the University of Southern California. From 2008 to 2011, he chaired the Department of Criminology here at the University of Pennsylvania. Over the course of the years, he also had quite a few visiting professorships as well. The University of Hong Kong, Department of Psychology, Institute for Criminology, at the University of Cambridge, Nanyang, hopefully I nailed that, Technology University, also in the Department of Psychology, and you currently also have a position at the University of York, correct?
Yes.
Perfect. Over the course of the years, he's accumulated quite a bit of awards and honors. In 1980, began the list with the Young Psychologist of the Year, awarded from the British Psychological Society. In 1993, Research Scientist Development Award was bestowed upon him by the National Institute of Mental Health. In 1998, he earned the Joseph Zubin Memorial Award for Distinguished and Creative Early Contributions to Psychopathology Research. In 1999, Independent Scientist Award from the NIMH. In 2006, he was named Fellow of the Academy of Experimental Criminology. 2008, Hewlett Award for Innovation in International Teaching. 2009, he earned the distinction of Fellow from the American Psychological Society. In 2011, he served as Vice President of the Academy of Experimental Criminology, then serving as President, term as President in 2013. In 2013, also marked his acknowledgement as being chair of the Division of Developmental and Life Course Criminology through the ASC, the American Society of Criminology. Rounding things out, in 2015, the recent popular book earned the Anatomy of Violence. I should reference the book. Was awarded the earned the Outstanding Book Award from the Biosocial Criminology Association. Over the course of his career, as most recent Vita notes, he's produced 383 peer-reviewed articles, books, chapters, encyclopedia entries of various sorts. 7 books over the course of his career: The Psychopathology of Crime in 1993, the Anatomy of Violence, the aforementioned book, produced in 2013, and a co-authored work with Andrea Glenn entitled Psychopathy: An Introduction to Biological Findings and Their Implications, was produced by the New York University Press in 2014. Dr. Raine lists as his research interests neurocriminology, biosocial risk factors for antisocial, violent, and psychopathic behavior, nutritional and cognitive treatments programs for aggressive behavior, reactive and proactive aggression, behavioral and molecular genetics, developmental psychopathology, neuroethics, neurolaw, brain imaging, psychopathology, and schizotypal personality. It's quite a mouthful there, covering the expanse of your career. Before you got into sort of the academic domain, can you give us a little bit of background in terms of who you were and your upbringing maybe, and
sure,
sort of life?
Yes. Well, I was born in Darlington, which is a small town in the northeast of England, about 50 miles north of York. It's about 100,000 in population. And my dad started off life as a bricklayer. My mum, well, she was Italian. So what do you do in England? If you're Italian, you sell ice cream. Okay. So that's how my mum and dad met, basically. And well, we had a lovely family life, really. I had 3 sisters and a brother. And I was brought up as a Roman Catholic because, you know, my mum was Italian. So, you know, it's like you're destined to be a Roman Catholic if one of your parents is Catholic. So I went to Catholic schools in Darlington. Primary school, secondary school were both Catholic schools. Yeah, that was a great time, I think, in my life. You know, great home life, I feel. And the schools were okay. Yeah. You know, they weren't necessarily the best, but they were pretty good. I was a very shy child. I really didn't have friends, especially from the age of 11 to 18. And that was just my nature, I think. You know, nothing special or untoward about that. I was never bullied at school, despite that, though. So I held my own ground, and I was a bit of a tough kid when I was younger. I used to wrestle. I used to watch wrestling programs as a kid, and I used to practice the wrestling holds on my younger brother. So that I held my own in primary school. I was pretty good in wrestling, and really right at the top of the class, even though I'm pretty scrawny, you know. So I got a good bit of respect, I think, early on because of that. And I think only just looking back over my life and thinking about, you know, links to what I do now, what I study, criminal behaviour, I think like many children, I went through a little bit of a rough patch, you know, from the ages of about 9 to 11. Mm-hmm. Nothing serious, not arrested or convicted, but I was in a little gang. We tried to set fire to mail, let down car tyres, got into fights here and there, but again, nothing serious, and I think a lot of kids tend to go through that phase. I think, as Terry Moffat would say, you go through it in the teenage years. Well, I was a little bit precocious. I mean, my phase was like 9 to 11. And nothing I'm proud of. I mean, you know, taking scissors to school to cut the skipping ropes of girls in the playground. I mean, that's not something to be proud of. But at the time, I really did. And it gave me a little bit, I think, of status amongst my peer group to be one of the crowd.
So, you know? What brings you into the academic domain then, in terms of why psychology or?
Well, sort of one thing, just to backtrack, is that you know, I think I never wanted to go into psychology. In fact, when I was a teenager, I never wanted to go to university. I didn't enjoy school, and when I was 15, I got this, you know, sort of belief or epiphany or delusion, you might say, that I ought to be an accountant. That, you know, I knew 2 things about myself. I was good at adding up numbers, and I was a very boring kid. A very boring kid, no friends, very isolated. There's actually a movie coming out right now called The Accountant, which I'm fascinated in seeing. I think Ben Affleck is starring in that. And so I thought, that's it, I'm going to be an accountant. So actually I left school at 18, not going to university, and I became an airline accountant with British Airways. I was a trainee accountant for British Airways. But it really is boring. It really is boring, and I just realised I just had to leave and get out. So, but I had no idea what to do. I had no thoughts or good ideas about where I should move to. And I'll never forget, it was a Saturday morning. I was in Smith's bookstore in England, and I picked up this book, and it was called Sanity, Madness and the Family. It was written by an existential psychiatrist called R.D. Laing. And his view is that schizophrenia, this major mental illness, is caused by faulty communication between the parent and the child. And so I thought, well, that's why I'm a little bit wacko, you know. It's all my parents' fault. But it was riveting. It was full of case studies of kids, adolescents who became schizophrenic. I thought, that's it. That's what I want to do. I'm going to become a psychiatrist. Oh. So I thought, well, first, maybe you should do psychology. So I went to the public library, got more books out, decided, yeah, this is what I should do. I should go to university and study psychology. So that's what took me into psychology. But, you know, it's like one of those flash points in life. It's like serendipity, it's chance. It's a book you pick up which sparks something, and then you read it. And you get
so then you begin the process of studying it formally?
Absolutely, yes.
Right.
So I went to Oxford University.
Okay.
I went to Jesus College, possibly because of my Roman Catholic background. I don't know. But I studied experimental psychology, which is really a branch of psychology that really emphasizes doing experiments to find out what makes people tick, basically.
So I know enough about psychology in a little bit of a way, at some remove, of course. The names Eysenck, the names Cyril Bird.
Yes, but
was there more receptivity to it in the European setting than maybe in the United States?
I think it was controversial even at that time. But I mean, Eysenck was around. He was in full flow. I mean, you know, I went to university in 1974. And he was controversial. He was certainly a controversial figure, protests at some of his talks. But he was influential. I mean, this was a time when we were really beginning to, you know, get the sense of there's quite a bit of human behavior which has, in part, a genetic basis. And that's something that Hans Eysenck pushed. I think one thing I did find influential towards the end of my 3-year undergraduate degree is a book he wrote called Crime and Personality. And that was definitely influential, I think, in what I then went on to do, because after my 3 years as an undergraduate, I went and did a PhD. Although there again, you know, I was actually convinced that I was going to be a primary school teacher. During the university holidays, I was persuaded by another student to join a charitable trust, which was involved in taking kids on holiday camps. So, you know, we'd have like 10 days and there'd be like 8 people like me, you know, each with 9 or 10 kids. And we're with them every minute of the day. We get them up in the morning, we take them for breakfast, we take them out for walks, play games with them, bring them back to the colony for evening activities, we put them to bed, read them bedtime stories, sleeping in the same dorm. And I just found that those experiences absolutely, amazing. I look back at my whole life and I think those are really the most precious moments of my life, those experiences with those children and the group. It was horribly stressful. I was absolutely burnt out, but it was amazing. And I felt at that time that this is something I can do. I can work with children. So I again developed the conviction again that I should be a primary school teacher. Primary because I dealt with a number of different groups of kids, 8-year-olds up to 15-year-olds. And I just felt I worked best with the 8-year-olds. So I thought primary school, I should be a primary school teacher.
So what then triggered the academic development in terms of scholarship and research?
Okay, so I'm in my 3rd and last year of my undergraduate degree at Oxford. And I applied for teacher training because you have to do a teacher training course before you can teach. Got that locked in at Brighton. Never forget it. It was late February. I was sitting in the tea room of the psychology department, and this graduate student sat down with me over tea, and she said, "So what are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, well, in my 3rd year." She says, "So what are you doing after this?" I said, "I'm going to be a primary school teacher." And she says, "You shouldn't do that. You should be a professor." And I said to her, and I've never forgotten this, it's one of these flashbulb moments. I said, no way. I mean, I know my group. I'm not one of these high flyers. And it was really true. Do you know what I mean? That when you're a student, you really know the bright, smart people.
Yeah.
They're these butterflies floating up here with creative ideas.
Yeah.
I'm this bumblebee at ground level bouncing around. You know, I knew myself. I wasn't a first-class honours student. I was a second-class honours student. I didn't have that intellectual buzz about me. But she said, well, yeah, come on, you could get a PhD. So I said to her, look, even if I got a PhD, I wouldn't be able to get a job. And she said, sure you can. I'm from America. You could come to America. There's thousands of universities there. You're bound to be able to get a job. And I never saw her again. It was like a 10-minute conversation. She wasn't any professor. She was a graduate student in psychology. And I went back to my flat that night and I said to myself, could I do it? Could I apply for a PhD and get accepted? And so I made late applications for a PhD and I got accepted at York University and Southampton. And so I went to York University and that's where I did my PhD. And it was, again, your life turns on a dime, on a conversation, a random moment, switching me out from being a primary school teacher to being where I am now.
Did you select York based on someone there who had an attractive research agenda that you thought you could insert yourself into? Or was it just sort of, that's where you landed?
What happened was, at that time, as I say, I lived in Darlington, and I went back home around that time. And it was at that time that my mum told me that my dad was dying of cancer. And this was quite a shock to me. And I was telling her about York and Southampton. And, you know, the reality was that York is only 50 miles north of my hometown. So, you know, amongst other things, I mean, that was a fact. It meant I could go back home every weekend and see my dad before he passed away. But at the same time, at York University, there was this man, Peter Venables. He was head of the psychology department, and he was sort of interested in what I had to say. And in England, you know, you go for an interview, you have to propose your study there and then about what you'll do in your PhD. And I had a clear idea, and I put it forward, and he was interested. So all round, that's how I got over to York University, a little bit due to family circumstances, but another thing by an attraction to Peter Venables and his work. He was a schizophrenia researcher. The bizarre thing is, he'd never done any work on antisocial behaviour at all, but he was intrigued by it. And he was intrigued by my proposition that there could be a biological basis to antisocial behaviour, even in school kids. So I was still hooked into, I want to work with kids. So I wanted to work with school kids. And at that time, there had been some ideas that you have these psychopaths, these adult psychopaths, where there may be some biological basis to that extreme form of antisocial criminal behaviour. But that thought hadn't been put down to the level of plain old antisocial behaviour in teenagers. So that was my proposition to Peter Venables, and he liked the idea and took me on as a PhD student. And I've been always very grateful to him for his mentoring.
So how do you get from York to USC, which has which had Sarnoff Mednick of all people, right?
That's right.
Right.
Okay, so again in England it's a 3-year PhD, and I did pretty well. By the way, I kept up the teacher training place. I deferred it for a year because I thought I could screw up the PhD in the first year. You know, I've never been a confident person in myself. And I've always been felt insecure, and I was lucky. I mean, things worked out well. My study went well in York. Then I wanted an academic job. I mean, that's what PhD students want, right? So I applied. I just couldn't get a job, and the only place that would take me was prison. So that's the only job I could get. I couldn't get any academic job, but I could get a job as a prison psychologist working with rapists, murderers, psychopaths, paedophiles, the run-of-the-mill
A little bit
offenders.
different than the second, third grade.
Yeah, different to being a primary school teacher as well. So yeah, I landed up at Hull Prison, a top security prison, dealing with lifers and all of these characters, and trying to help them. I mean, I was there as a psychologist. By the way, I was totally untrained. I had no clinical training whatsoever.
Wow.
But in 1980, people didn't really care, about who gets let loose on prisoners to practice some cognitive behavior therapy. So I was there for 4 years. I have to say, that was stressful. It was a stressful time. There were some close shaves in prison, and I always wanted to get out. And over the 4 years, I applied for 67 academic jobs and got 67 straight rejections. I like to brag a little bit that I think I'm the only tenured academic I know who was rejected by Papua New Guinea. I did apply. They do have a psychology department. I did apply. Nobody would take me. Polytechnics in England, like teaching university, they wouldn't take me. 68th application was at Nottingham University, and the head of department, he was looking at my CV and he said, "Wait a bit, you used to be an accountant for British Airways? I used to be an accountant too." And then he said, you did psychophysiology in your PhD? So did I. And I swear to God, it was just complete serendipity, a really bizarre connection. And I got accepted for that position as a lecturer in behavioral sciences in the medical school at Nottingham University to teach psychology to medical students.
What do you think was the impediment? That the research agenda, the biological aspect of things? Was it just criminological interests weren't just in favor, or?
I think looking back, it just wasn't on anyone's radar screen at all. It didn't ring anyone's bell.
Wow.
Biological basis to antisocial behavior. It's not something that's mainstream anywhere, neither in criminology but nor psychology either. So that was a tough time, and I've often reflected, when do you give up in life?
Yeah.
And why did I not give up? I always try and tell students, don't give up.
Yeah.
If you've got a passion and excitement, go for it. Never give up. You'll get there in the end. But at some point you do have to give up and change track. And it's only people with frontal lobe pathology who have these perseveration deficits. They keep on doing the same thing despite being told no.
So did you ultimately publish your way out of that position? And then that attracts the attention of folks in the United States, or was
right? So I was very happy. Now I had a job. I mean, this is wonderful. I had an academic job. I mean, I was out of prison after 4 years.
You're a free man.
Absolutely. Because I thought I'd be in prison the rest of my life. But so it was nirvana to me. Wonderful. Really like the students, my colleagues. But in 1986, so 2 years into the job, Sarnoff Mednick organised a conference in Italy on crime and violence, and looking at biology, including biology. And my PhD supervisor was a colleague of Sarnoff Mednick. So that's how Sarnoff Mednick in America, in California, heard about me. He invited me to this conference. It was a NATO conference, funded by NATO, held in Tuscany, in the hills of Tuscany. And I'll never forget it. I gave a talk. I was lucky. I was, one of the invited speakers. This is my first big talk. Gave my talk, and Robert Hare, a leading researcher in psychopathy, was the discussant. And he fortunately was really favourable to me and said some nice things. Immediately after the session was over, Sarnoff Mednick came up to me and said, we have an open position at the University of Southern California. I'd like you to apply. So I said, no, I'm very happy where I am. Thank you, though. It's an honour, but thanks. Because, I never wanted to go to America. I never had any desire, not even for a holiday, to go to America. this was a long conference. It lasted 10 days. It was a residential conference where we stuck in this hotel.
So the lobbying begins, I suppose.
Yeah, and so Sarnoff came up to me a couple of days afterward and said, "Do you like opera?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "I'll take you to the opera." And he drove me one night during the conference to Lucca, a medieval town in Italy. Took me, we had a box in the opera. I mean, it was wonderful. He was the organizer of this whole big meeting. I was this like little assistant professor with the big shot guy.
Yeah.
And driving back to the hotel, he said to me, "Look, I know you're not interested in this job, but why not come and just give a 1-hour talk, no commitment. You can stay with me. I live in the Hollywood Hills. I've got a swimming pool. We can work together. I can show you around. You can come for a whole week." So I thought, wow, these stupid Americans, they'll pay me to go and do that? So I left England at the end of November. I went to USC, gave the talk, and you know, you get to LA, the sun, the palm trees, the beaches. I thought, gosh, I've got to do it, you know. I got sucked in, basically. And so after my third year at Nottingham University, I left to become an assistant professor in psychology at the University of Southern California.
And so there's also a simultaneous move in a bit of a way in your research agenda as well. So the schizophrenia,
Yeah.
and then the sort of slow evolution into,
That's right. Yeah,
into
that's
psychopathy.
Right. Yeah. So my PhD was the biological basis of antisocial behavior. But I'm not, you know, that nobody's biting on that, are they? I'm not getting any job. I go to the medical school. My PhD supervisor studies schizophrenia. The head of department was a psychiatrist who studied schizophrenia. And right underneath my office was the brain imaging lab. So I applied for a small grant to the Medical Research Council because through Peter Venables, my supervisor, I did have an interest in what's called schizotypal personality disorder, like a watered down version of schizophrenia. And I got this small grant from the Medical Research Council, started off brain imaging on schizophrenia there. So I was now getting into schizophrenia research. Moved to USC, where yes, Sarnoff Medic was a schizophrenia researcher with an interest in antisocial behavior. So I didn't know what to do because really my heart was in antisocial. So I applied for 2 NIH grants, 2 grants to the National Institute of Health. One of them was on schizophrenia. The other one was on antisocial behavior. And it was the one on antisocial behavior that got funded. That
serendipity again.
Yeah, again, yeah. If the dice had rolled in the other direction, I certainly wouldn't be speaking to you right now. So that intrigues me. How are we really in control of our lives?
So I see sort of a theme here, kind of emergent in a bit of a way, in that you're kind of hemming things together. You're kind of independent in a bit of a way, in a lot of sense, because you're not following in the footsteps. There's not a pre-established agenda that you're kind of advancing the ball in a little bit of a way.
Yes.
So how is it that you begin the process there of kind of hemming this together, piecing this kind of collage together?
The collage, you mean, of biosocial research?
The influences must have been coming from a number of different places, and then you, through your own imagination, your own grit, and your will, begin the process there of making this coherent.
I mean, I have to go back a little bit, I suppose, in that when I was at school at the age of 13, you had to decide between arts and sciences. And I've never forgotten the day you were in the playground and you have to join one of 2 lines.
Oh, wow.
And I've never forgotten being there in the playground and people joining the lines, and I didn't know. I just didn't know. And I moved to the arts line. So I specialised from that time onwards in arts. I never did any biology at all in school. None. I'm mentioning that because how I got to this collage, I think. So for example, from the ages 16 to 18, I studied only three things: English literature, medieval history, and economic and public affairs. So I was very much arts, no science background. I gave up mathematics at 16. But I think though, getting the training in biological research with Peter Venables, doing my PhD, I still had that art, social science background, and in fact, Danziger's works as a sociologist really was influential to me on socialization. And in fact, that was one of the title of my PhD thesis, even though it was biological. So I think how I got into the biosocial side of things, in part, was through very much the arts background, getting a little bit of more harder science work in experimental psychology at Oxford, and a bit of exposure to biological research, even though it was hard for me to absorb it. And then the 3 years of the PhD where I really learnt more on biological functioning, and then moving into my academic job at Nottingham with brain imaging right there in its early days. I think that's partly how it came about, that I always had a foot in the social psychology camp. It was my strongest subject as an undergraduate.
Now, over the course of time, you must have seen just the growth and the perfecting of the instrumentation with the biological markers have grown exponentially. Can you talk to us about how that has helped kind of advance and maybe the change our appreciation for this?
I think for me, most of all, it was brain imaging. It's brain imaging that really, I think it's made a big difference. I think outside of criminology, brain imaging is everywhere. Magazines, newspapers, everyone knows what an MRI is.
Yeah.
Everyone knows. It's on TV shows. We all know what it is. Yeah. And I think the advent of brain imaging and the technology there has opened up everyone's eyes into how there's this brain behavior relationship, down to what you buy in a supermarket and what brain areas may be firing when you see your favorite chocolate bar, down to could it even be brain factors that in a way shape criminal behavior.
Would you credit that as being sort of the thing that gives it entree into the field now, that it gives it repute in a way in which Lombroso's kind of thinking may not have
actually, going back before brain imaging, behavioral genetic research, I think, really began to mount from study to study, all showing almost that about 50% of the variation amongst us in antisocial behavior can be chalked up to genetic factors.
All right.
And I think a point came, and I think the tipping point was 1984 when Sarnoff-Mednick published a paper in Science, an adoption study, showing that the adopted away offspring of criminal offenders are more likely themselves to become criminals compared to adopted away offspring of parents who were not criminal. I mean, again, that was still controversial at the time. There was hot water. There was, it was still tough at that time. But that adoption study, combined with the twin studies, that definitely, I think ultimately you just can't escape from the fact. Yeah. And I think brain imaging builds on top of that.
Okay.
And it's a little bit more dramatic because you get color pictures.
Right.
You don't get color pictures with behavior genetic research. And it sounds cartoonish, I know, but we're all visual as well as verbal. And every picture tells a story. And I think that gave some understandability and some connection to the public, where you could look at two pictures. You could look at a brain scan of a normal person and a brain scan of a murderer, and anyone in the community could say they're different.
Yeah.
You can see it there. You can see poorer glucose metabolism in the prefrontal cortex. That's a study we did in 1994. And that made a difference to my life and career because at that time there was a potential donor at the University of Southern California who I believe was on an aeroplane flight that day. She bought US News and World Report at the airport. I was on the front page. And the figure was on the front page. And that's led to the donation to University of Southern California, and my first endowed chair came directly from that. So it really is, I think the brain imaging did have traction in a way that behavioral genetics didn't, but behavior genetics was really the foundation for changing our minds about criminal behavior is not just a social phenomenon.
Right.
It also has biological roots.
Now there's a whole retinue of tools that have kind of come into tow.
Molecular
as well.
genetics, that's right.
Yeah.
Genotyping individuals. The Caspian-Moffitt study,
Right.
MAOA combined with child abuse,
Yeah.
predisposing dramatic interaction effect. That 2002 paper is really probably the most influential social science paper of the decade.
So what do you think some of the enduring elements are going to be when we're all dead and gone? What do you think the sort of lasting element of the contribution will be here? Because sometimes these schools become sort of hot in there.
Yes.
There's tools and there's research money that's allocated to these kinds of things, and so and there's a genuine hope here that we can develop a set of tools that will help us counteract.
That's right,
some of the
whether it's molecular genetics or
Right.
brain imaging or hormonal research, psychophysiological research that we do, for example, neuropsychology. There's certainly a lot of techniques and tools there. In terms of how the future will go, if that's really the question, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah.
In that, back in the early 1990s, and I think it was 1991, the head of the National Institute of Health was unveiling the Violence Initiative. This was going to be a new source of funding for violence research. And when Fred Goodwin was the director at that time, and when he was unveiling the Violence Initiative in Washington, D.C., he was talking about social disorganization and how social disorganization can result in crime and violence. So he made the comment, and I'm trying to quote him here, I think I've got the quotation right. I think he said, it's not just the careless use of the word when we refer to certain areas of certain cities as jungles. This led to allegations that this was going to be a racist program where people will go into inner cities to drug up rebellious kids. I remember going to a conference, for example, on the genetics of crime and violence, and it was broken up by protesters. So the 1990s were difficult times, and I think funding agencies got scorched by this. And right now the National Institute of Health does not fund violence research. They'll say, well, that's the remit of crime and violence. That's the remit of the National Institute of Justice. Well, NIJ have much smaller budgets, really.
Yes.
And while they do a lot of great forensic work, let's put it this way, I've never submitted a grant to NIJ. I just don't think it has traction there, frankly. And other researchers say the same thing, both at NIJ, National Institute of Health. So there's still this shadow over biological research on crime.
Will it be able to overcome that at some point? I mean, I wonder what the tipping point for that will be in terms of the emerging. Is it the linking with it's now going under the rubric of biosocial as opposed to purely biological, and I think there have been enormous concessions from quite a few.
Yes. Well, I think you mentioned a tipping point. I think there's something like that, or something similar to that, occurring round about now, in my mind. Let's put it this way, back in the 1990s, as a psychologist, I would go to ASC and give a talk, but the questions would always be about eugenics and things like that. And I went for 3 or 4 years, but I got really tired of that. And I just stopped going. And it was really when Larry Sherman brought me to the University of Pennsylvania from USC that I really got going back to ASC. And I must say, times have changed. And I think there is greater receptivity to biosocial criminology, more now than there's ever been. And I see more and more of interest, cautious interest, in how we can integrate biological knowledge with social knowledge to better help people ultimately, not just understand, but actually to change. And I think it's like a slow movement, very slow movement. It's nothing dramatic, and maybe that tipping point perhaps hasn't come yet. Maybe it'll never come. I don't know.
Yeah,
Maybe there'll
yeah.
still be a slow, gradual shift. Maybe it won't.
Right.
Maybe it will dissipate. But I think it will continue to gain traction. And I think that's partly predicated on the decade of the brain
Right.
that we had. Revelations on molecular genetics, what brain imaging research is showing, what the public are seeing. I gave a public lecture at York University just last week. And I was struck. I mean, this is an open lecture for people. York's not a big city. It's like 200,000. They had 370 seats. They quickly had 450 tickets gone. They had to block it at that. The auditorium was totally full. People in the aisles. They threw in a book sale for The Anatomy of Violence. That was my idea, but they said, "Oh, you've got this Anatomy of Violence book. We'll do, after the talk, you'll sign the book." I've never seen a line that long.
Wow.
It was incredible, and they ran out of books. I mean, all the book signings I've done since that pot boiler came out 3 years ago, I've never seen such an intense interest. So I think that things are changing here. I think the big challenge for the discipline of criminology, however, is that one could be a criminologist with an open mind and open eyes and say, hey, there could be traction here of buying into biological research, integrating it with our social knowledge, and we can do a lot better. I think the downside is, understandably, if you are a seasoned, tenured academic, it's going to be hard to retrack and get on board with the new tools.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's a difficulty for criminologists who do want to who see that there is a gain to biosocial research.
So I found
And
that
that's a challenge.
when reading an awful lot of your work, you're drawing from a completely different glossary. And so the challenge for me in preparing for this tiny little interaction is rather monumental in terms of just wrapping my mind around a whole new world of terminology, of constructs, of measurement tools.
It's a foreign language at times when you begin to talk about neurochemistry, neurotransmitters, and different brain areas.
So how is criminology going to begin the process there of overcoming that gap?
Right, yeah, overcoming the gap. So there's two things. One is getting the background knowledge to people who've never had that knowledge before. And that's the training of new scientists. So to backtrack, The Anatomy of Violence is a book I wanted to write not just for the intelligent lay public, but also, card-carrying criminologists who, would never previously have touched biological research with a barge pole, but just to try and write something reasonably readable, to get over some basic concepts and ideas. I wanted that to be a sort of start, because I don't think we've quite had a book that's sort of done that.
It reads much, much differently than your first book in '93.
Absolutely, yes.
Really, there's a palpable difference.
Yes, because the first book is an academic book. The second book is a trade book, and I have to reach the public.
Right.
And without dumbing things down, it is a challenge, though. I must say, and it's the only time I've written a trade book. Really difficult, because you don't want to dumb down the science, but you've got to explain.
I've also noticed that you've written quite a few pieces that do kind of, you wouldn't call them meta-analysis because they're not statistically oriented, but they are an attempt to sort of take a survey look at here's what the sort of the state of knowledge of these things and pull those bits and pieces together.
Yes, and I think in my scientific writing, I don't always succeed, but even in my scientific writing, I'm more and more trying to make it understandable to a multidisciplinary audience, because this is the buzzword we've been hearing now for 2 decades, multidisciplinary. So we need to be able to have our science understandable to other scientists at a scientific level. But going back, the Anatomy of Violence is to try and give people something reasonably readable, just as a beginning point. But the other challenge is the training, and the only way I see through this is that I think it's the next generation of criminologists who may carry the biosocial flag further up the hill, basically. And I think in my own mind, in my very limited and small way, with my PhD students, and my hope is that they're the people who will make the difference. Not me, they will. That, they'll have gained a PhD in criminology, they'll be versed in traditional criminological theories, which I never had that education.
All right.
But they'll have the biological and neurocriminological perspective and research background. And they'll be able to hopefully take it as assistant professors to new departments where they can begin to do more collaborative research with other criminologists, and then perhaps slowly there'll be a reasonable representation of biosocial work in criminology. Right now, it's really small. When I go to ASC and I look in the back and I look at biosocial and I count the number of papers there, and I do check them, and some of them actually aren't biological at all. I don't know how they snuck into that index. But it turns out that between 1% and 2% of all papers at ASC have anything to do with biological factors. And yet the research is saying, look, half of the equation is biological and genetic. We're missing something.
So I think part of the worry here, in a little bit of way, is that criminology now has its own independent infrastructure. Yes. So it's cranking out its own graduates, and so it's largely hiring from within the family.
Yes.
And so your generation was largely trained in all the sort of the polyglot,
the outsiders,
right? And so that's the integrative element. I think is in many ways it's arguably on the decline, and so that could present some.
I think it does, and I think when you get to hiring, we like to hire our own image and likeness. I think we often play God in picking the next generation of faculty, and we're
tribal.
We're human beings. Yeah. It's natural. I'm not blaming anyone. But I do see changes right now. I'm seeing changes right now in interest from traditional criminology departments in, for example, my own PhD students over the past 2 to 3 years. And that gives me some hope, I think, not just for me turning out biosocial criminologists, but also other researchers as well in criminology who are turning out biosocial researchers.
Another major impediment that we see, and I'm thinking of someone like Nikki Rafter's work, are some of the ethical implications and some of the legal implications, and you've written quite a bit on some of those kinds of things. And so could you talk to us a little bit about the general propositions about how this may be different, a different manifestation that will hopefully overcome or subdue some of those Lombroso questions that you were getting
I mean, I think at some level there are still similarities. I mean, because fundamentally Lombroso was arguing there is in part a brain basis to crime. That proposition is still here with us now. I think what's gone is the racial element, where Lombroso was creating a evolutionary hierarchy with North Italians and Jews at the top of the hierarchy, and people from Bolivia, Peru, and southern Italy at the bottom of that evolutionary hierarchy. I mean, no matter how kind you are to Lombroso, you have to say there were racist elements in there. I don't see that. And actually, people may be surprised, in my whole career, 39 years now of doing biological research on crime, I haven't come across racist biological research on crime. I haven't, and I think I'd find it. I think, with a few beers after a symposium, people may let the guard down. I haven't seen that. So there's been allegations of that. And so that gets me wondering about the allegations. And I think there's a number of dimensions here. I think first of all, there's always an honest concern, and we must have an honest concern about where genetic and biological research could take us, given the misuse of this type of research in the past. No question that we must be cautious and careful. And we must be open and honest, I think, about the ethical implications here. But at the same time, and so to understand the kickback that you get on biological research, I think it comes at a number of levels. And I think many of a lot of the kickback is very well intentioned. I would think it's misplaced, but it's well intentioned. I think one of the concerns is, look, they've got it wrong. There's no biological contribution to crime causation. Crime is a social phenomenon. It's got social causation, and that resides in poverty, discrimination, bad neighborhoods, and many other factors too, many other social factors. And I think the concern of earnest social criminologists is that begin to acknowledge the biological and genetic underpinnings, the spotlight will be taken away from these important social concerns, and too much attention will be given to the biological research on crime and violence, and that will be a loss to society. I think that's one form of thinking which I can understand and is earnest and honest, I think. But I think it's not correct. And I think there are ways of integrating biological and social research to really do a much better job than what we've been doing now. I think, another concern is misuse. That's true. And we also have misuse of social research as well.
Sure.
So that's a concern that really applies to all levels and shouldn't just apply to
There's also this issue here of legal culpability, right?
Yes.
The moral culpability.
The issue of free will.
So that you've actually toyed with this kind of thing. The very opening of the anatomy of violence is very personal in terms of you've been victimized in a very real way, and you're kind of playing devil's advocate in your own imagination. It's this Jekyll and Hyde here in terms of how you react to this. What's the appropriate reaction to this kind of thing?
What is the appropriate reaction? I think it depends where you come from in society. If you're an academic, and I'm an academic, you think, look, we need to work out what the causes are and how to change it. That's got to be the top of our agenda. And concepts of retribution have been overplayed. Our prisons are overflowing. We need to pull back from this. Do a lot more work on rehabilitation, treatment, intervention. And I would say, as a developmental psychologist, starting early. Getting in early because it's never too early to start the change when kids are more malleable and flexible. And I know there's arguments against that approach. Of course, it's never too late either. Right, so that's one starting point here.
You actually use you've got a chapter in your most recent book. The prevention, intervention, and treatment seems to be, I think it's a nice kind of way in which we can
we certainly have to move to that. My current research is very much on that, and with Peter Venables, my PhD supervisor, we did an enrichment study in Mauritius where kids were given better nutrition, more physical exercise, cognitive stimulation from ages 3 to 5 years, and that led to a 34% reduction in criminal offending 20 years later. So I'm a real advocate of moving in there.
You're even talking about prenatal stuff. Prenatal, the womb.
Right. You get back to the issue, born to crime.
Right.
Yeah, nobody is born to crime, but other factors early on in life, even before the child is born, which raises the odds of criminal offending, well, absolutely. And the social factors there, and there's also biological factors too. And I think just to be aware of these and see, well, how can they be changed? How can we change people's biology? But that's where you get into the free will issue. And and then there's the legal issues. So, I mean, to put this in simple ways, we've argued that bad brain leads to bad behavior. From the brain imaging research. Let's assume that's causal. Well, the question then is, well, how are you going to upregulate the brain to change behavior? And the other issue is, if the seeds of crime are sown really early on in life, even before the child is born, through genetics and, mothers who smoke and drink during pregnancy, for example, are people really responsible for their crimes? Now that's uncomfortable to people. At the same time, biological risk factors, in my mind, are no different to social risk factors.
Okay.
Being
Yeah.
born into
Yes.
a disorganized family, having a biological father who's criminal, and a bad parent, or even absent.
Yeah.
Or because your parents are poor, you end up in a bad neighborhood with a
Right.
criminogenic environment.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's as much social as biological. But for some reason, the biological part seems to raise this issue
Yeah.
more poignantly about, oh, does that mean we don't have free will? And we all want to
Right.
believe we have free will. We all want to believe we are active agents without
Right.
constraints. And the law assumes that.
And maybe it's just a stilted or kind of an antiquated notion of what social science is, as well as sort of an antiquated. There's a sort of a notion that biology is fixed and it's immutable and it's unchangeable.
Pleased you've said that, because
Right.
it's such. I understand why people.
And it's science too, right? And so
That's right.
it's got this patina about it that it's
Yeah, and of course it's a misunderstanding by the public and even academics.
Right.
Biology is not fixed at all.
Yeah.
Social influences change the brain. You've changed my brain physically with this interaction, and
Right.
I've changed
Right.
yours. New
Right.
synaptic connections have been formed. Physical changes in the brain, new memories have been formed.
Yeah.
There's a neurophysiological basis to that.
Okay.
And we have to accept that the social environment changes the brain and can do in a way to change behavior. And I think that's one of the
Right.
new advances that I think criminology can make in the future.
Okay.
So one thing I've always thought, I think, and going back to the concerns of traditional criminologists, I think the concern has been, if we recognize biological research, then we're going to lose control.
right.
We're going to lose control of our fields, that we're going to be usurped, for
Yeah.
example. That's an honest fear, I think.
Sure.
And I genuinely and honestly feel that, yes, there could be direct links between biological predispositions and crime, but I think it's much more common that the biological factors interact with social factors.
Yeah.
So that when you've got both together, you get an exponential increase in crime. That gives traction to social scientists.
Yeah.
But more than that, I think social criminologists can think of social factors causing biological brain changes,
Oh, wow.
which then
Yeah.
in turn have implications for criminal behavior.
All right.
And if you see it that way, from social to brain to crime,
iterative,
it's
it's
the social horse that's driving the biological
All right.
cart that drags some people down into the prison gutter. And I think if we have that way of thinking, and I earnestly believe that, then I think traditional social criminologists, they're leading the field. Their research is pivotal. They're the horse.
I think there's also sort of an underlying kind of reservation there as well, in terms of the toolkit that it has, the list of remedies, the myriad of elements there, the policy prescriptions. We're very much policy. We're in the orbit of policy. We're very much concerned about, so what are the implications? What do we do about this to make a better world?
Yes.
And so biology suggests a different medicine cabinet, a different toolkit, a different set of instruments that ought to be sort of leveled against the crime problem. What kinds of things do you see in terms of development on that end?
Right. So it's getting back to the issue of, okay, if this is true, if
Right.
there's this brain biological basis, what are we going to do about it?
Right.
Right. So the one level of research that we're doing at the moment is nutrition, because we've done research showing that kids with poor nutrition are more likely to be antisocial and aggressive later on in life. And there's a lot of other research on that. So we've been doing randomized trials on omega-3. And I think as many people know, omega-3 is contained in fish. It's a long-chain fatty acid that's critical for brain structure and brain function. It makes up about 30% of the cell membrane. It's involved in neurotransmitter functioning. It's involved in gene expression. Omega-3 enhances the lifespan of the neuron. It results in greater dendritic branching. By the way, I'm getting very technical
Yes,
now.
we
talked
are.
about not getting technical. Neurite outgrowth,
Right.
the axon has greater transmissible properties. But anyway, here's something, a benign substance, I think, fish and omega-3 and contained in fish oil. And so we've been doing randomized trials on this and showing some results that, yes, it does reduce antisocial aggressive behavior. I mean, we need a lot more research, and there's a recent review coming out on this, not from our group, but saying, yeah, there's something to this. There's already been 2 randomized controlled trials in prison showing that giving omega-3 to young offenders reduces offending in the prison by about 35%. So it's, it's food for thought.
Yeah.
It's food for court as well.
Yes.
I mean, and magistrates
Right.
are becoming more interested in this issue, and judges too.
Well, that has a social policy that's attached
That's
to it.
where we get
Right,
down
so-
to social
right.
policy. That's right.
So there's a compromise that is, right, it's just built in.
That's true.
Yeah.
So, and I think nobody would kick back against that. There's another approach which is also benign, and that's called transcranial direct current stimulation.
Oh.
Now,
Yeah.
what that is it's passing an electrical current through the brain. Now,
So people have shock therapy and kind of
it's
like
a little
shades
bit.
of...
It's a little bit like that.
Right.
It sounds very scary,
Right.
and it sounds like
Frankenstein, yeah,
reborn
yeah.
here. But one of my graduate students has been doing this, doing a randomized controlled trial, upregulating. This
Right.
technique upregulates the very frontal region of the brain, which our prior brain imaging research has shown is functioning poorly in violent
So
offenders.
this is to enrich, enhance, and to boost that.
To boost that part of
all
the
right.
brain. And there's very few, if any, side effects. It's totally benign, very well tolerated. And this isn't published yet, but I'm sure it will be somewhere before too long. She's showing that this reduces criminal intent. It reduces intent to commit a violent crime. It reduces the intention to commit a sexual violence offence. Now, it's at the very beginning stages
Sure,
here.
right.
That this all needs to be replicated, extended. But are there other directions also that biological criminology could move to? Now, I don't think people would be very happy
Yeah.
with that. But then again, why not? If there's little cost to it,
Yeah.
few side effects, and big if it does reduce criminal intent,
Yeah.
and criminal intent is the first step towards criminal behavior,
Yeah.
then what would be so bad in bringing it on board as a treatment?
Yeah. I think that there are 2 things within that broad gambit here that I kind of want to get you some feedback on here. One of which is this early detection, right?
Yeah.
So you have the sort of the hallmarks or the earmarks or these indicators. And there's also, I think, a vein that deserves some commentary reaction as well. Limits to rehabilitation,
Yeah.
a potential issue here. So,
Well, let's start with the limits to rehabilitation, because I think it is never too late.
okay.
I mean, my bias is to start early
All right.
and intervene with children. And not wait until they reach the difficult adolescent years and the formative juvenile delinquency years. And I know again, it's still never too late. There are good, interventions for serious juvenile delinquents, which are effective, good psychosocial interventions. But nevertheless, I do think that we can make changes with adults too.
Yeah.
That so not my research, but the research of 2 other groups, young offenders in prison. So the limits on brain change. Let's step back a bit. This technique, cognitive behavior therapy.
Right.
Well, that's effective with
Yes.
offenders. We also know that cognitive behavior therapy changes the brain.
Okay.
We know that it's a classic treatment for depression. It's my colleague in psychiatry here, Tim Beck, who developed cognitive behavior therapy.
Yeah.
Classic treatment for depression. And what the brain imaging research shows, if you look at depressives before and after the treatment, is that brain functioning is changed in the direction of normalizing brain functioning, and they improve. So here's an odd thing. A lot of the things that we do, social interventions, go through the brain
Oh, all right.
and change the brain.
We're just not
We're just not acknowledging,
Right.
of course, it's hard to do brain imaging research on social
Yeah.
interventions. Very costly, very expensive.
Yeah.
But where else does behavior come from?
Yeah.
Where does behavior change come from?
Yeah.
It comes from the brain, has to. And so the only question is whether other techniques, there are other avenues for changing the brain to change behavior. One thing that I think parents would never like is medication.
Right.
But scientifically, there's no question that medications do reduce aggressive behavior
Right.
in children and adolescents. More than 45 randomized control trials, a whole range of medications are effective in changing aggressive antisocial behavior. And if everything else fails, it is a last recourse. And no parent wants their kids
Right.
on medications. But whether you go from atypical antipsychotics to stimulants to antidepressants, they work. In fact, atypical antipsychotics, medications developed to treat psychosis, are the most effective medication for reducing aggressive and antisocial behavior in kids and adolescents, even if they're not psychotic, even if they're not crazy, if they're just plain conduct disorder, antisocial. It helps. And what I wonder in this is that, having violence around us is big business. I mean, we have courts, we have police. Reducing violence doesn't pay quite so well. And if you take drug companies, no drug company has ever tried to develop a medication to reduce aggression. Now, given that by chance some of the medications that they have developed do reduce aggressive and antisocial behavior, if there were, if there's some impetus for a drug company to try and develop a medication for reducing aggression, maybe in the future, and it's not going to be soon, but in the future, I mean, won't be a silver bullet that's going to shoot down the crime figures, but I see that as a potential in the future. Now, I think a lot of people don't want that, and again, for lots of reasons. Are we turning people into zombies? Are we taking away their freedom of will?
There's side effects involved.
Yeah.
The children do they have autonomy?
Yep, and what we have to do is, as ever, weigh risks with the benefits.
Right.
There's no way you'd ever go through with that if the risks outweigh the benefits. It has to be a careful balancing act. But, let's turn to something else. Mindfulness training. So there's, again, randomized controlled trials showing that mindfulness training upregulates the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain that we and many others find to be dysfunctional in antisocial individuals. And neurologists have shown that if that part of the brain is damaged or impaired, the person changes into becoming an antisocial, psychopathic-like individual. Mindfulness training upregulates frontal lobe functioning. It also upregulates a part of the brain called the amygdala. It's deep in the brain, and it's the center of emotion. Now, you've heard of psychopaths, these cold-blooded, callous people lacking remorse, lacking guilt, lacking conscience. Well, they have these blunted emotions, and we find that they have a shrunken amygdala. It's reduced in volume by 18%. It functions less well when we give them moral dilemmas, which make us feel emotional, because when you give somebody a moral dilemma, do you push one man off a bridge to save 5 lives? Would you do that? Well, most normal people, their amygdala gets highly activated. When we give that dilemma to psychopaths, they show a significant reduction in amygdala activation. We know mindfulness training upregulates the amygdala, in part because we're focusing on how we're feeling, what our internal feelings are, and as well as the acceptance of our state. So, I mean, what's so draconian about mindfulness training? or You know, and is giving omega-3 to children really eugenics?
Right.
No, it's not. I think there are benign ways
Yeah.
that we can look at biologic research on crime and begin to develop intervention and prevention programs or supplement current programs
All right.
with these forms of treatment. I mean, that's a beginning, at least.
You've mentioned randomized controlled trials throughout, and could you talk to us a little bit about this, where experimentalism exists within the criminological orbit? Because it is kind of a new approach to,
It is,
to
yes.
developing
I
our
mean,
science.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I know Larry Sherman has flown the flag
Yes.
with many other people on
Right.
experimental criminology. And the Journal of Experimental
Yes.
Criminology is doing terrifically well. But I agree, it's sort of a new, sort of a newcomer in a way.
Yeah.
To criminology. For me, it's like going back to my roots when I studied experimental criminology. And actually, a lot of my research has been correlational. Brain imaging research is correlational. It's not causal. So actually, more in the latter part of my career, I'm turning back to my earlier roots on experimental criminology. I mean, the idea is in experimental criminology, look, the only way that you can document causality is by manipulating a variable.
Right.
And looking for change. You can conclude causality from
Right.
that. Or you, at least a lot closer.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the way that I'm going, and I think a number of other people are going in criminology, recognizing, you know, when push comes to shove, we have to take our theories and, you know, the applications and you know, put it into practice.
Yeah.
And let's see, again, what works and what doesn't work for evidence-based policy.
Okay. Yeah. I think that there are the pushback in some ways is that there's still some manipulation happening here in terms of the assignment and who's getting the red pill and the blue pill, placebo, this.
Yeah, and to tell me more, the concern is
that we would have a policy that would have some sort of benefit that would be denied to some and provided to others.
Yep.
People would be blinded to the fact there that they've been put in a particular context.
Right. Well, now, first of all, if we're talking about the experiments, I mean, all has to have human subjects approval.
Right.
So everyone knows that this is a randomized controlled trial. There's two groups, and you know, you're not going to know, the experimenter's not going to know.
Sure.
So at that level, but what you're talking about is ultimately, if a treatment is shown to, let's take omega-3.
Okay.
If that treatment is shown to work,
Yeah.
then are there some ethical issues in the application of that science to policy and practice? Well, the way I say it is, let's take a public health approach to this.
Okay.
And you know, the idea is that we're not targeting. One strategy is target those, wannabe criminal offenders, or who are showing all the risk factors for crime, at least, targeting them and dosing them up with omega-3, for example, manipulating their diets. That's one approach, and the concern of that is stigmatization.
Okay.
So the other approach is the public health approach, where we just raise everyone's consciousness increasingly, not just that omega-3 is good for cardiovascular functioning, it's also good for stopping crime.
Okay.
I think some change could come about. Let's think in school cafeterias, for example.
Okay.
Mind you, changing people's dietary habits, we know, is very hard. But we're talking in, sort of theoretically about what the issues are. To answer your question, we could get away with the concerns by the public health approach. The problem there is that we're spreading the butter very thinly to everyone, including the people who don't need the help. The alternative is, do we screen everyone for who's got low omega-3 in their blood, and then do something to try and make sure that they eat more fish? For example.
Yeah, trade-offs involved everywhere.
That's certainly true. In a way, thinking about it, with social interventions, we go to the places and locations where the social problem is, or where the social cause is, and try and do something about it. Let's take bad neighborhoods. We want to try and, gentrify the neighborhoods, or we want to do that. Maybe a parallel to that is going to the people with, for example, poor frontal lobe functioning, and seeing what we can do through benign techniques to get them to upregulate their
Yeah.
dysfunctional prefrontal cortex. But that's more of a concern, isn't it? It's not a concern to change neighborhoods, but it is a concern
Yeah.
to...
So maybe there's a dual standard. Is maybe there's just or misconceptions that kind of.
Or maybe there's just something entirely different about biological research that makes us all feel differently about
Right.
it.
Okay.
In some
Yeah,
way,
yeah.
some way, it's like medicine, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we begin to think
Right.
of, oh, does that mean it's a pathology?
Right. Okay.
And
yeah.
you know, there's kickback against considering recidivistic crime as a clinical disorder.
Oh.
But
Yeah.
I wrote a whole book on that back
Yeah.
in 1993. I do believe recidivistic crime is a clinical disorder,
Yeah.
no different to anxiety or
Right.
depression.
Okay.
You've got risk factors.
Right.
You've got social debilitation. You've got harm and suffering.
Yeah. So thinking about all the different things, of the nearly 400 articles, books, etc., what would you look back on as a contribution that you think you really nailed it, or that's the thing that you would appreciate people at a toast to you at 50 years out? What would that be?
Yeah, well, I suppose there's a number of ways of answering that. You know, it's what I like about my research and what
Yeah.
other people like, and they're actually different.
Right.
I think the paper that sticks out most in my mind is the very first paper I wrote in 1981,
Wow.
which is on a biosocial approach to antisocial behavior. It's an empirical study.
Yeah.
It's on fear conditioning and social class, bringing a traditional social measure, social class, showing there's an interaction between social class and biological fear conditionability in predisposing school kids to be antisocial. That was my very first paper. So I'd like people, you know, when I say, oh, look, come on, biosocial, that's the
Right.
way. I think some people think that that's a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah.
I think some people think, oh,
Right.
you've got these sneaky eugenicists who are trying to, you know, it's
Yeah.
intrusion, you know, sell their evil eugenics biological research into this neat biosocial package. And I don't really believe it, but I like people to look at that first paper. It's probably one of the worst papers I've written. But I collected the data. I was so buzzed about it at the time. And I think for me, back in 1981, to think about a biosocial interaction, and not just talk about it, but have data and documented it.
Yeah.
I'm proud of having done that. And I think thinking about that, I'm proud of a paper that I did in 1990. Of course, you know, there's always colleagues and collaborators, but a paper I first authored in 1994 showed in a big sample of 4,000 that birth complications combined with maternal rejection of the child in the first year of life triples the rate of violence 18 years later. And when I look at that paper, I do think it's, I shouldn't brag, should I? But if I was to brag,
Right.
I would say I think that was the first convincing demonstration of a real biosocial interaction. And so at that level, I'm proud of that. You know,
Yeah.
Temi and Avshalom,
Yeah.
Temi Moffat,
Yeah.
Avshalom Caspi, did a much greater job on that in 2002 with a molecular genetic paper with child abuse. Lovely, sophisticated research. But I like to think at the beginning that even in my first paper,
Yeah.
I got my mind around the fact that, look, it's not just biological, it's not just social, it's both of them together.
So would you say that was the birth of an enduring agenda? Everything seems to fit within this that framework
Into that
that you've kind of
biosocial
set
model,
up.
yes and no, because I didn't really feel I got any traction from that.
Right.
It didn't really do anything
Yeah.
to criminologists. You know, again, didn't ring their bell.
Right.
You know, so I think stayed a little bit more in just looking at straight biology in relation to antisocial behavior.
All right.
And that got me into brain imaging, which is really straight brain to behavior. Having said that, I think the brain imaging work I did in again 1994, the same year, with my colleague Monty Buxbaum, showing that 41 murderers compared to 41 controls have a reduction in frontal functioning. I'm proud of that too, because that was a bit of I think a breakthrough in brain. It was really the first, paper on functional imaging and, homicide, murder, and I think that made a change. I think that also caught people's attention and really made a difference, and I think made some people sit up. Not everyone, of course, but
now, when you first started out here, were you aware that you were taking sort of an enormous risk in the agenda that you had envisioned?
You mean when I started my PhD?
When you started your PhD and you had this idea of genetic, some sort of biological influence?
Not at all. No, it was just an intellectual interest.
Right.
Actually, when I'd met that graduate student and in that 10-minute conversation, I went back to my flat. Well, the first thing I had to do is think, well, what do I do a PhD in? And so I look back, in Oxford you write essays, you write 2 essays a week and present them to your tutor one-to-one, and he rips it to shreds.
Yeah.
And so I look back at all the essays I'd ever written, and actually looked to see what were the best ones. One was on autism. So I actually asked around about doing autism research and doing EEG work on autistic kids, and the autism researcher said, no, it's way too difficult. I mean, autistic kids are so hard to deal with. The other essay was on social ethology. It's like behavioral observation of children in playgrounds. Yeah. Very much social developmental psychology, observational.
Cultural anthropology.
Absolutely.
And that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that was me. I wrote a really great essay on that. And so I explored that and at Sheffield University, and I could have gone and done that. But the third essay was on the biological basis of psychopaths. So that's really how, that gave me the intellectual spark and the idea of, hey, could we apply that to just plain old antisocial school kids, the run-of-the-mill school kids? But at that time, no, you don't. At least, maybe I was a clueless graduate student, but I don't think graduate students quite think that way. Or at least I didn't. No, no.
Now, looking back on your career as it's kind of unfolded here, any second thoughts about things that you wish you had done, or trajectories that you think that would have been worthwhile? Or we're thinking here with the mindset towards the next generation watching this, in terms of trying to figure out, what do I need to do to be successful?
The first thing that comes to my mind maybe doesn't answer your question, but when I look back at my career, and if you're asking, would you have done something differently? I think I've thought a lot about, I sort of wish I'd been a primary school teacher.
Yeah.
I feel that I possibly could have made a bigger difference to people's lives than I've done really as an ivory tower academic.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of a regret to me looking back at my life that I never did that.
Yeah. I think the reward structure seemed to be different.
Yes, it is different. But if you can make a change for the good in the life of a young child, I mean, it's magical.
Yeah. Sitting up here writing books and publishing articles and hoping to be cited is a different kind of, it's a more abstract kind of.
So I think that's one thing. If I switch back into, okay, so if you stayed in your academic career, what would you have done? I'd like to go back and start again.
Right.
Epigenetics is so exciting to me. How the environment changes gene expression. Wow. If I could go back and start right now, today, I'd jump really straight into that.
Yeah.
I think that's so exciting. And I think there's so much promise there, not just within the field of criminology, but everywhere for all of, a lot of human behavior. That's really exciting to me. I sort of wish I could do that.
What's made you a successful academic? Are there a set of intangibles, or is there a genuine skill set? Is it?
Yeah. I think I feel like an imposter because I
Yeah.
never quite feel I've been successful in
Right.
some ways.
Yeah.
But at another level,
It's a difficult question.
Yeah,
It
at
is.
another level, I think people see me as successful.
Right.
So if I buy into that delusion, then what can I say?
Was it the early risk that ultimately just paid off?
I don't even think I
You don't think of it as a risk? Yeah.
No, I was just doing it.
You were just
because
interested in
I-
what-
Yeah, and
Yeah.
wanting to do it and thinking, well, what else can I do? And otherwise I'm either backed as an accountant or I don't want to go back to that.
British Airways
Yeah.
needs.
So I'm
That's a
re-
tough one. In a lot of ways, it is.
I'm not quite sure. I'm still struggling with to what extent you stick to your guns, to what extent.
Right.
I tend to tell students, look, find the fire in your heart.
Okay.
Find your passion and stay with it.
Okay.
And no matter what, you stay with it, because there's times in life when your back's against the
Yeah.
wall and the cold winds of life are blowing,
Yeah.
and what keeps you alive and moving, it's the fire in your heart,
Right.
the passion and excitement for something you love,
Yeah.
that's going to keep you going through life. But then a part of me sits back and says, that's hogwash. Sometimes you just got to throw in the towel. And I think I've never quite known when to throw in the towel. And I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
And I've had a lot of criticism.
Yeah.
There's been tough times. There's allegations of racism,
Right.
which are really upsetting.
Yes.
And
That almost lays waste to an entire paradigm in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Because the link is with crime and criminology, and the patterns being the way they are. People make inferences, and then they begin to assign meaning, and then impute that into the research community. And so it can be. One book you didn't mention, for instance, was Wilson and Herrnstein, 1984.
Yes.
That is kind of in terms of its
Bell curve.
position, in terms of the canon, then the bell curve wars, and that occupied the better part of the early 90s, at least.
yes, and that certainly set a tone,
Right.
I think. And I think still has resonance. That
Yes.
bell curve has resonance, certainly today. That
But-
hasn't gone away,
right.
and that's to be lived with and
Yes.
struggled with. And
Right.
I think I feel sorry mostly for my poor students who are doing neurocriminology and
Yeah.
biological and biosocial criminology, because for any student in criminology, it's really tough to publish a paper in a decent criminology journal.
Yeah.
But if it's got the mark of Cain with it too, it's
Right.
biological.
Yeah.
Whoa,
Yeah.
it's triply hard.
Right.
So I've managed to struggle my way through the quicksands. I'm just hoping that my graduate students that there'll be firmer footing going ahead.
It's interesting. I've just reread in the preparation here the introduction to Anatomy of Violence, and you talk about the interest of Celine and Lombroso.
Yes.
The interest Wolfgang writes
Yes.
a master's thesis
Yes.
on Lombroso and his paradigm, and then just sort of the continuation.
And I'm
in a bit of a
living in
way.
their house.
Right. So it's a nice seamless kind of connection. In a
It's
lot of
it's
ways.
funny how things come around,
Yeah.
but I think these world-leading, world-famous criminologists, I think the gift they had is an openness.
Okay.
Not
All
a
right.
total acceptance, but an openness and an open perspective.
Okay.
I would love future generations of scientists. If you're asking me what advice could I give
Yeah.
to young beginning scientists, it's to recognize that the possibility exists that you can be mistaken in your funnel view.
Oh.
That there's you may not agree with some sides, but keep your mind open to understand the issues, and not be bigoted in terms of, or have an utter conviction that you're totally right. I think we always have to have the humility that we can be wrong. I mean, I could be wrong in my whole career
Yeah.
of these past 39 years of putting my eggs into
Yeah.
this basket, and
That-
what
yeah.
will it come to? I
Yeah.
mean, if it doesn't benefit society in the long run, it's a
Yeah.
waste of time.
Yeah.
And I should have gone back and studied something else in
Right.
psychology maybe child development, you know.
Is there anything that you think criminology needs to be paying more attention to in terms of the things that are beyond its sort of immediate purview? You think it ought to begin the process of incorporating?
Well, I think we've mentioned experimental criminology,
right.
And hopefully
Yes.
that's a movement that will continue. I think it is so important.
Yes.
We do have to rigorously test our theories, and by manipulating variables, it's really the best way to document causality.
Okay.
Ultimately, we have to get to that.
Yeah.
I think that's one area. I think the other thing that we've touched on to emphasize is, you know, to keep our minds open to how the social environment can affect brain functioning, gene expression.
Okay.
I think in the future, in the next, you know, 10, 20, 30 years, I mean, I think these are intriguing areas to be pursued, and important. And again, it's not that everyone should be dropping their tools and moving. No, we can't do that.
Right.
And we must have stability within criminology, and we must build slowly and carefully, no question.
Yeah.
I think replication and extension, I mean, that issue has come up in the past year, whether psychological research really replicates. I suspect criminology does a better job in replication.
Yeah.
But, you know...
will that come through the developmental? Will that the developmental camp be sort of the entree for that?
I think so, yeah. But I think it's open to all of us, really, to replicate and extend. I mean, yeah, we publish our first paper, but to keep on going. I mean, for me, for example, so I started doing one omega-3 study, but I'm doing several now.
Okay.
And no matter what, I'm want to publish those findings, even if there's nothing there.
Yeah.
I want that to get out, really.
Okay.
And so I think I'd like to see that a lot more in criminology.
Yeah.
I think that's an important arena.
Okay.
I think most of all, I'd like to see a more genuine and open integration of biological with social research, because I do feel there's enormous promise in that, and that everyone can be a winner in that venture.
Okay. I think we've sort of reached the end here, and I typically like to end with a sort of a general question of, did we miss anything, or anything beyond the formal items here that you think merit inclusion on the record here?
There's probably 1,000 things.
Right. I every time I turn these things off, I begin the process. I should have asked this.
I think if you keep asking more questions, I think it'll lead me on to more things that I could talk about.
Yeah.
I mean, nothing obvious, really.
Okay.
Nothing
well,
obvious.
I think at this point, we'd like to thank you for your time here.
Thank you. I mean, I've really enjoyed enjoyed the interview.
You know, the last part had me sort of like the passion to take this by the horns. So.